Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Miklós Ilyes. I have been using Arteriograph device and Arteriograph software for more than 10 years. In the following, I would like to share my experiences how to evaluate the Arteriograph report. We can see here the Arteriograph report, its first page. We can see the patient data, we can see the risk profile and medication if we added, and also we can see the measurement data regarding the date and time of the measurement, what kind of database we use, the patient height, the arm circumference, which arm was used to measure the parameters, and the cuff side. Let me remind you that always the right arm should be used for the measurement because of anatomical reasons. In the suprasystolic record, we can see the obtained pressure curve, pulse pressure curve, the brachial blood pressure and pulse analysis, and we can see the central hemodynamic parameters. Let's start with the pulse pressure curve. The standard and normal pulse pressure curves can be divided into two parts by a valley in the curve, which is called diacritic notch. This is created by the closing of the aortic valve, distributing and splitting the pulse pressure to systole and diastole. Inside in the systole, we can distinguish two separated systolic waves. The first wave is due to the ejection of the left ventricle into the aorta, and then this way the first systolic wave is created. The second wave, it is its reflection from the aortic bifurcation, and then this reflected wave carries information about the peripheral vascular resistance. Basically, the higher the amplitude of the second systolic wave, the higher the peripheral vascular resistance. Here we can see, as I mentioned, the closing of the aortic valve as diacritic notch, and here we can see the diastolic pressure waves. In the middle panel, we can see the brachial blood pressure values and the pulse wave analysis of the brachial artery. We can see the systolic blood pressure, brachial, diastolic brachial blood pressure, pulse pressure, which is the difference between systolic and diastolic pressure. We can see the mean arterial pressure and the heart rate. Here you can see the aortic and brachial augmentation index. In the central part, as I mentioned, we can see the aortic augmentation index, the aortic systolic blood pressure, the aortic pulse pressure, which is the difference between systolic and diastolic pressure, and we can also see the ejection duration. Let's talk about the meaning of the different parameters. I think I don't have to explain what does the brachial blood pressure mean. However, it is very important to emphasize the difference between the central aortic blood pressure and the peripheral blood pressure, because the central aortic blood pressure physiologically always lower than the brachial blood pressure. Indeed, in this case the brachial blood pressure was 122 mercury and the central aortic blood pressure was only 115.9 mercury. It is related also the pulse pressure, as I have mentioned. This is the difference between systolic and diastolic pressure, and called the pulsatile element of the blood pressure. The pulse pressure in the brachial artery was 51 mercury, and in the aorta was only 44.9 mercury, thus physiologically lower. Indeed, there is a so-called physiological pulse pressure amplification from the aorta towards to the peripheral arteries. As I mentioned, the aortic augmentation index was 24.2%, while the brachial augmentation index was minus 26.5%. we can see a difference in minus and plus. It is a very big difference. Despite of this fact, they are basically absolutely comparable because they are moving together. The difference is only the scaling, like the scaling difference between Celsius and Fahrenheit to describe the temperature. The ejection duration is the duration when the aorta is receiving the blood from the left ventricle during the systole. So this is the time when it starts by opening the aortic valve and until the closing of the aortic valve of the left ventricle, and the blood is ejected into the aorta. This parameter today is not so important because we do have better parameters to describe the left ventricle function, such as ejection fraction by ultrasound. For this reason, we do not take into account into the evaluation. However, the central systolic blood pressure, central pulse pressure, and augmentation index very seriously taken into account. You can see a numbering of this parameter 1, 2, and 3, 4, and so on. So in the third page of this report, we can provide a detailed description of each parameters together with their normal value. Basically, the systolic blood pressure of the aorta, as I have said, always physiologically lower than the peripheral brachial blood pressure. This is very important to know because in case of increasing central blood pressure, there will be increased cardiac afterload. Thus, there is a very big chance to develop vascular hypertrophy and left ventricular hypertrophy as well. If we go to the so-called volumetric analysis of the report, called diastolic record, we call it this diastolic because the pressure curves are obtained during the diastolic pressure filled up and pressurized cuff pressure. So when we pressurize the cuff, repumping to the diastolic pressure, we can obtain such kind of pressure curves. Please be noticed that here you can see only one wave together in the systole. You cannot distinguish the first and second systolic wave. This is due to the fact that despite of the suprasystolic pressure, when we completely occlude the brachial artery and we can obtain only pure pressure signals, and then the waves are separated, this cannot be seen in the diastolic cuff pressure recording because due to the flow and due to the Bernoulli principle which plays role in this process, thus the capability of obtaining the first and second systolic wave separated, it is not possible during diastolic recording. We have three parameters describing the diastolic pressure recording, such as diastolic reflection area, systolic area index, and diastolic area index. The diastolic reflection area gives you information about the pressure in the diastole and the duration of the diastole. Because the left coronary artery is perfused mostly in the diastole pressure conditions are playing an important role in the left coronary filling conditions. The longer the diastole, the higher the pressure during the diastole, the better the left coronary filling. Indeed, the diastolic reflection area parameter describes these circumstances. Thus, the higher the diastolic reflection area value, the better the left coronary filling. This is normal if it is higher than 40 unit. In this case, it turned to be normal. If we take to be 100% the whole area under the pressure curve, and if we divide it by the systolic and diastolic part, we can see the area during the systole and area during the diastole. Obviously, the higher the diastolic area, the better the left coronary filling condition. This value is somehow about 50-50. If it is higher than 50, the left coronary filling condition is perfect. Going to the next page of the report, we can see pulse pressure curves, which helps us to compare them to each other. We can see that because of the good technical performance and proper technical performance of the measurement, these curves are identical to each other. Also, this visual control is accompanied with the quality control, which is metric control. Namely, we measure the pulse wave velocity on beat-to-beat basis, and the measured differences are expressed as standard deviation of the differences. Obviously, the smaller the differences between the beat-to-beat measured aortic pulse velocities, the lower the standard deviation. Ideally, if the measurement is technically performed properly and good, we can see this range in the green zone, and then we can see that the standard deviation of the beat-to-beat measured pulse velocities were only 0.24 meter per second. If it is falling to the yellow, this means that between 0.7 to 1 meter per second, the measurement is questionable, but if it is falling higher range than the 1 meter per second, which is the red zone, we have to repeat the examination. Here we can see the measured aortic pulse velocity, which turned to be 8.2 meter per second in this case. Also, we can see on the right side the return time of the pulse wave. Return times means that the time to travel down from the aortic arch until to the bifurcation and to be reflected. So if we divide by 2 this time, we can get 1 go. Consequently, we can get the time of the pressure wave propagation on the aortic part. Then, if we give the distance, which is the aortic true length based on the height, we can calculate and we can measure the aortic pulse velocity in meter per second. In the lower panel, we can provide information about the arterial age of the patient. The arterial age is generally assessed by measuring the aortic pulse velocity. The pulse velocity is very strongly connected to the behavior and the characteristics of the aortic wall. The stiffer, in the other words, less elastic, in the other words, more rigid the aortic wall, the faster the aortic pulse velocity. Indeed, we can see that in this case, the aortic pulse velocity was rather slow, and then it refers to the elastic aorta, which was free from calcification. We have a strong data that the increased aortic pulse velocity is a mirror and a marker of the increased aortic wall damage, which is primarily due to the aortic wall calcification. Furthermore, we have very strong data that the higher the aortic pulse velocity, the higher the occurrence of the later developing cardiovascular events such as stroke, myocardial infarction, congestive heart failure, angina, and even heart and death, cardiovascular mortality and morbidity. In the arterial age assessment, we base this assessment on the basis of the measurement of 10,000 Caucasian subjects from age of 3 until 90. Here you can see the so-called LMS percentile curves of the population from the 5th to the 95th percentile. The median is the 5th percentile, which is based to determine the arterial age of the patient. In this case, we can see the patient who was 66 years old during the measurement had a value only 8.2 meter per second, and the 8.2 meter per second is somehow around the 45 or 46 years, Thus, we can conclude that this certain patient, aortic pulse velocity was falling to the 46 years old category, and this patient arterial age, better to say aortic age, is younger than the patient's chronological age. Unfortunately, it could be opposite. The patient might show and might have higher aortic pulse velocity, referring to increased or advanced vascular age or arterial age as compared to his or her chronological age. Please be reminded that the aortic pulse velocity is influenced also by the heart rate, by the systolic blood pressure, and by the cardiac output. Thus, in case of increased blood pressure, increased heart rate, or any other circumstances which can increase the cardiac output, the aortic pulse velocity can be increased. So, in this case, obviously, we will see other arterial age. For this reason, the standard conditions, which are very important to follow during the examinations, are mandatory. And then in the next chapter, we can provide you information how to measure the patient, what kind of conditions should be followed, which are not so much different from the standard blood pressure measurement, but important enough to be able to provide standard conditions in which the measurements can be repeated properly. As I mentioned, on the third page of the arteriograph report, you can see the description of each parameter which we measured. You can see the aortic systolic blood pressure, which is, as I said, physiologically lower than the peripheral brachial systolic blood pressure. Its normal value based on a survival longitudinal study when we followed up more than 4,000 subjects for more than 5 years, and then the hard cardiovascular outcomes were all-cause mortality, non-fatal myocardial infarction, and non-fatal stroke. So this threshold is not a statistical threshold on the basis of the measured parameter distribution in the population. These parameters and these thresholds are so-called clinical thresholds, which refer to the outcome. The pulse pressure of the aorta is the difference between the aortic systolic blood pressure and diastolic pressure, is normal under 50 mercury. Indeed, in the strong heart study, Mir Rahman clearly showed that if the aortic pulse pressure is higher than 50 mercury, the chance to get later developing cardiovascular events is much higher compared to those who are having lower pulse pressure in the aorta. The aortic augmentation index is mainly determined by the peripheral arterial tone and resistance of the small arteries and arterioles. This is mostly influenced by the endothelial nitric oxide synthesis. Basically, the better the endothelial function, the higher the nitric oxide synthesis, and the more profound the vascular vasodilatation in the small arteries and arterioles. The aortic augmentation index turned to be normal under 33% in our scientific data, which was mentioned before, such as longitudinal study with hard cardiac outcomes. The ejection duration, it is the ejection time during the systole from the left ventricle to the aorta, and this is influenced, of course, by the heart rate. However, this parameter is not taken into account the evaluation of the report, but if you wish, you can see the normal values which are described by Weissler and co-workers in the left ventricular ejection time index in men paper published in the Journal of Applied Physiology in 1963. The next parameter which we measure is the return time of the aortic pulse wave. The return time is the time to travel down from the aortic root until to the bifurcation of the pulse wave and its reflection back towards to the aortic arch again. So the reflected time and so-called return time reflects to the characteristic of the aortic wall. The stiffer, in other words, the more rigid the aortic wall, the lower the return time because the pulse wave propagates faster. According to our survival study, the return time turned to be normal if it is higher, was above than 124 milliseconds. The next parameter is the aortic pulse velocity. Obviously, its parameter is based on the measured return time. The pulse velocity is determined mostly by the characteristics of the aortic wall. The stiffer the aortic wall, the faster the pulse velocity. According to our scientific data, which as mentioned, this is the prognostic and longitudinal study, it turned to be normal, it is under 9 meters per second. The increased aortic pulse velocity are related to increased cardiovascular risks, which has been proven in very strong and very nice evidences by very strong scientific papers. Very probably the aortic pulse velocity increase refers to the atherosclerotic organ damage. So the vascular age assessment is based on the aortic pulse velocity, and as I mentioned formerly, higher systolic blood pressure and/or higher heart rate can increase the aortic pulse velocity, causing enhanced lateral tension, stiffness to the aortic wall, and in this case it can lead false arterial age assessment. So before concluding the arterial age, please take care on the pulse, blood pressure. The standard deviation I already mentioned. The standard deviation is the so-called quality control parameter. We measure the standard deviation on the basis of the beat-to-beat measured aortic pulse velocity values. The lower the standard deviation is, the better the quality of the recording. And as I have said, the green range is the good measurement quality, it varying between 0 to 0.7 meters per second. If it is falling to the yellow or especially to the red range, it cannot be accepted to the for the evaluation, and the examination has to be repeated. So I mentioned that the arterial stiffness and the arterial age assessment is based on almost 10,000 measurements and 10,000 subjects, Caucasian subjects. So this is the basis of the arterial age assessment. Diastolic reflection area, I already mentioned. This is a very good parameter to describe the left coronary artery filling conditions. The left coronary artery provides the blood and oxygen to the left ventricle of the heart. So this is extremely important parameter. Because the left coronary filling is mostly performs and happens during the diastole, the duration of the diastole and the pressure in the diastole plays important role, and this parameter provides information about this. It is normal if it is higher than 40 units. I already mentioned what is the systolic and diastolic area index. The area is based on the duration of the systole and diastole and the area under the curve. The higher the diastolic area index, the better the left coronary perfusion. We found the normal value around 50. Finally, I would like to stress again that the thresholds values, which are already mentioned, were obtained from hard cardiovascular endpoints follow-up study using Arteriograph. It was published and presented by Thomas Kahan from the Karolinska Institute as aortic stiffness measured by a novel oscillatory method independently predicts cardiovascular morbidity and mortality, a study of 4,146 subjects. The place where it was presented is the European Society of Hypertension Congress in 2013 in Milan, and it was the oral presentation on the 17th of June, Monday. Very finally, Here you can see on the fourth page of the report your report and your opinion. I wrote about this patient that patient had normal peripheral central blood pressure, which indeed we could see. The patient had normal augmentation index 8 in the aorta, and then it was normal aortic pulse velocity as well. So we were able to conclude that the patient parameters were absolutely normal, and the presence of asymptomatic atherosclerosis in this case had a very, very low probability. Unfortunately, not always the case. Like we have observed, we can see pathological parameters as well, which will be the content and the topic of my next presentation and next video, where you are mostly welcome again, when I would like to provide you examples how to evaluate pathological arterial stiffness reports. So I would like to show you some very interesting case reports regarding the different possibilities how the arterial stiffness parameters and arterial function parameters can be pathological, and what are the consequences in these cases, what to do with the patient, and how to manage the patient further. Thank you very much for your attention, and looking forward to seeing you and meeting you on our next educational video.